It's good to see you all again. We're going to be continuing our series, Fascinating Stories of Forgotten Lives. We journey through the Old Testament with some folks that we maybe have forgotten about or didn't know about, didn't learn about because they weren't some of the major characters that we usually run across. And last week we looked at Caleb, and today we're going to look at Rahab. And so if you want to turn to Joshua chapter 2, that's where we're going to be starting today. You know, when you go to a movie, sometimes the hero is plain as day from the very beginning, isn't it? Like, you just know the movie starts and you're like, yep, that's going to be the hero, because they telegraph it to you. They make it easy to see and understand. And so you just know from the beginning, wherever this thing's going, that person's the hero. But there's other movies where it's not so obvious. They stay a little incognito for a while, right? And at some point throughout the movie, then they just rise to the surface at the right point in time. And you're like, oh, that person, they went from obscurity to being the hero, and an unlikely hero usually, right? Because they usually don't show up as the heroic looking one at the beginning. That's part of their obscurity before they come to the surface in that perfect moment when they are needed and called upon. And that's the kind of hero we're going to see today, an unlikely hero. Rahab is not the person you would choose as the movie opens up. So you would not choose her as the hero of the story, but she's going to be. And this scene today is sort of like one of those intense spy movie kind of scenes. You know, you can picture the Mission Impossible theme behind it or something like that, or the James Bond theme, whatever you want, right? The Jason Bourne music in the background as these things are playing out in front of us. And if we put ourselves in their shoes, you really start to feel that sort of intensity of the situation of what is at stake. And so we're going to, like I say, start in Joshua chapter 2, but I want to make sure we can get from where we were last week to today, that we understand what's happened in between the two. So last week we talked about the 12 spies. They went from Kadesh Barnea up into the Promised Land and to investigate it. There was 12 of them that were sent up, and when they came back, 10 of them said, no, we can't do this. We don't trust God. We're not gonna do what God has said he's going to do. We don't think we can do this. And only 2 of the 12 came back with a positive report and saying, yes, we can and should do this. And so the people as a whole revolted. They didn't want to go in, and God basically said, yeah, if you don't want to go in, I'm not going to make you go in. So now you get to wander in the desert for 40 years. You get exactly what you want, just in a way you didn't want it. But that's what happened. And so they wandered for 40 years in the desert. And so now 40 years has passed, and now they've come up kind of on the eastern side of what we know of as the Promised Land. And so if you picture like the Mediterranean Sea, and then you have land, and then you have the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea kind of on the east side. They are east of that even. And in this time, we're going to find out here in a second that they have fought a couple battles. They've won some area from the tribes of Sihon and Og. And so they have part of the Promised Land that is theirs. But now they need to cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land to take the rest of it. Moses has been their leader for these 40-some years, but part of his punishment for his unfaithfulness back in the desert was he will not get to go into the Promised Land. And so we have his death on the east side of the Jordan, and a new leader has been put into place, a man named Joshua, which is the namesake for the book that we are in today. And so here they are on the east side of the river, and just on the west side is this large city named Jericho. And they're preparing to go cross in to fight the Battle of Jericho, the same battle that you sang about in junior high choir. You know the one. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, that one. Now you know why I wasn't in choir. But it's the same one, right? That's the one where they're getting ready to go in. But this is happening right before that happened. Okay, so let's join the story here in chapter 2, verse 1. Joshua, son of Nun, he's now the leader, sent 2 spies out from where they were camping it and secretly instructed them, go in and find out what you can about the land, especially Jericho. Now let's stop right there, because I want us to hear the parallels between what happened last week and this week. Okay, so last week they sent spies to investigate the land, right? And they sent 12 last time, and now they're sending 2. Last time, we were named all 12 of them. This time we don't know their names. We have no idea who the 2 were. Last time, the 12 were sent very publicly. Everybody knew the 12 were going in to investigate, both before they went and when they came back. You remember the big public report and then the outcry? This time it's in secret. Nobody knows. The first time, 12 went in, 10 came back, unfaithful, saying, no, we can't do it, and only 2 were faithful. This time, only 2 are going in. I think there's a parallel here. So we see the echoes of what happened before happening again. Okay, so let's continue. They sent them in to explore the land, especially Jericho. And these 2 spies, they stopped at the house of a prostitute named Rahab and spent the night there. The king of Jericho received this report. Note well, Israelite men have come here tonight to spy on the land. So the king of Jericho sent this order to Rahab. Turn over the men who came to you, the ones who came to your house, for they have come to spy on the whole land. Okay, so we've had these 2 sent in. These 2 men go to a prostitute's house, and that is where they're planning to spend the night. But the Canaanites who control this land, who are the ones who are living in Jericho, they clearly know the Israelites are over there across the river. They know their presence. They're not surprised by this. And so now, as they are aware of their presence, they know that 2 have now snuck in. They've been identified, meaning like, hey, we've seen them around. And last time we saw them, they went into Rahab's place. And hey, y'all ought to go take care of them. Right? Are they trapped? Are they stuck? Like what's happening here, right? And so the king knows. He's like, we can't have spies because we know they're coming. We know what their intentions are. So I picture him sending some military officers into the city, over to the edge, the corner over against the wall where Rahab's house would have been. And they knock on the door. Miss Rahab, we hear there's a couple gentlemen here with you, and they happen to be Israelites. You may not know this, but they're here to spy on the land. They've come to confront the men. Of course, they want to arrest them, right? And take away the threat that these men pose to them. Now, there's this interesting question of why did the men go to Rahab's house? It's a question that I've heard asked many times. And I have a couple different options here, I think. I think either A, they went for her services. Let's be honest, they could have done that. Or I think they might have gone to her because she would have been a woman of lots of resources in terms of knowledge of the community and things like that. And she would have been an outcast of the society. And as we're going to find out here in a little bit, her house is up against the walls of the city. So A, that makes her very exposed, but B, that gives them an escape if they were need to get out. And so they could have gone, they could be in and out of her house all night, and nobody would have thought different because she's a prostitute, right? And that's what happens. I think that's probably the answer. Now, I've heard people argue otherwise, but I think that's probably the answer, that they were being wise and resourceful and knew who to go to for what information they needed and to be safe and so forth. But who knows? But they're at her house. And so now the military has come. They've knocked on the door, and they're saying, hey, Rahab, give us these 2 gentlemen. Let's see how she responds. I'm going to skip around just a little bit here, okay? So the story, I can make the story a little more coherent for us, so bear with me. I'm going to start in verse 4, and then we're going to jump to verse 6 here in a second. So, but the woman hid the 2 men, okay? So they knock on the door. She hides the 2 men. Jump to verse 6. Now she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them in the stalks of flax that she had spread out on the roof. Okay, so she's hiding them under the stalks of flax on the roof. Now go back to verse 4 where we left off. So she answers the door. Yes, these men were clients of mine, but I didn't know where they came from. When it was time to shut the city gate for the night, the men left. I don't know where they were heading. Chase after them quickly, for you still have time to catch them. Jump to verse 7. Meanwhile, the king's men tried to find the men on the road to the Jordan River near the fords. And the city gate was closed as soon as they set out in pursuit of them. Okay, so it must have been just after flax harvest time. And so they had taken all of the flax that she had harvested and laid it out on her roof so that it would dry in the heat of the sun. And so she took them in and hide underneath here and fluff it up and make it look like nobody's there, right? And so when the soldiers knocked on the door, then what did she do? She lied to them. She lied. She knew exactly where they were. They're upstairs under the flax, but she lied to them. Now, on the surface, this may not seem like a big deal, but here in a second, we're going to find out that she actually believes in God, that she's a faithful woman in terms of her faith. She understands who God is. And so we're posed with this moral dilemma all of a sudden, that a woman who believes in God just lied to government officials. Do you feel the tension of that a second? I was actually surprised as I was researching this, how much attention scholars give this, that this really does create a moral dilemma for some in asking the question, is it okay for us to lie or sin and otherwise if we're doing it in the name of God? To serve him, to follow his purposes. And I can point you to a couple like major theologians that you know the name of who would argue yes, it does. Now, I personally don't believe so. I don't believe that it justifies it. I think what she did was wrong. She sinned in doing it. And the fact that she was helping God on his mission doesn't justify what she did. But here's what I want us to also understand. Here in a moment, we are going to see that she is a believer in God, that she acknowledges Yahweh and who he is. She, although knows what she believes, it's interesting to me to ask, how does she know that? What has her experience been to get her to that place of believing in God? And what has the experience been since that forming of that belief to disciple and grow and mature her? Because she's a Canaanite woman. And it's not like Jewish folks were walking around town evangelizing people. How did she know? And I don't know the answer, but this is what I know. That she knew enough to come to a place of having faith in God and placing her belief in who he was. But she was not at a place of being matured and developed and understanding in what God believes and what God says and how he directs our lives to have been really transformed very much, because after all, she is a prostitute. And so what I think is that in this moment, she is doing what came natural to her. To tell a lie. She was not a truthful woman. She was not someone who was an upstanding, righteous citizen. So she did exactly what came natural. In the heat of the moment, she was giving her allegiance to this God that she didn't know much about but was believing in. And so she lied, hid them in, and did exactly what came natural to her. It doesn't justify it. It doesn't make it right, but that's what she did. And so here she goes, sends the soldiers on a wild goose chase down the road towards the fords when she knows the guys are upstairs under the flax. This is an interesting situation that she finds herself in. Think about the risk that she is taking. She has just worked against her own people, against her own government on behalf of these two guys that she's got stashed upstairs. If she was found out about, what would happen? She would certainly be killed. She's just a prostitute. She's disposable in their culture. Nobody would miss her. She was taking a huge risk. She was risking her life on behalf of what she believed about God and these two men stood for in her life that had just showed up a few hours earlier. So, now verse 8, we're going to get some of this information that's playing into what I'm talking about here. Before the spies went to sleep, Rahab went up on the roof. I picture her coming up and she's like, guys, we gotta talk. We gotta have heart to heart. Got to get on the same page here. And she said to the men, I know the Lord is handing this land over to you. We, meaning the Canaanites, the people of Jericho, are absolutely terrified of you, and all who live in the land are cringing before you. For we heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you left Egypt, and how you annihilated the two Amorite kings, Sihon and Og, on the other side of the Jordan. When we heard the news, we lost our courage, and no one could even breathe for fear of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above. Let me start over. For the Lord your God is God in heaven and above, and on earth below. Okay, so she's made three important statements here. The first is she is confident in the outcome of this conquest, of this pending battle. She is confident in what is going to happen, that the Israelites are going to win and the folks of Jericho and the Canaanites are going to lose. She's already said that. I'm confident of that. And then she gives us a picture inside what the Canaanite people are thinking. See, God, his reputation has gone before the Israelites, which I find amazing because if you think about it, they've been wandering in the desert for 40 years. Just until recently with these two battles, have they really been up to much, if you will? But yet his reputation has gone before them. So the people are melting with fear. They understand what's happening. They have seen God's reputation at work, and they know they're next. And then the third one is right there, the second part of verse 11, the part I stumbled all over. And that is her statement of faith. That she makes a statement that the Lord, Yahweh, your God, she's pointing to the Israelites saying, your God, I'm acknowledging, I understand who he is. This isn't one of her gods, one of the Canaanite gods. It's their God. She is stating her faith in God. And this is significant because of who she is and this position that she was not Jewish. I think this also reflects something interesting that I'm sure they didn't notice in the moment, but I think is interesting as we look back. We think about the Abraham story and the Abraham covenant, and that part of the covenant was that they'd be a blessing to all people, and that all people would be brought back into a relationship with God, including Canaanites. So in some ways, she is part of the fulfilling of the Abrahamic covenant, of the Canaanite people, the non-Jewish people being reached and blessed by the Jewish people. I'm sure they didn't see that in the moment, but that's part of what's happening here. And so she's made this incredible statement of faith to these two men, showing where her heart is, where her allegiance is. And then she continues in verse 12. She says, so now, promise me this with an oath sworn in the Lord's name. Now that's significant. You think about her saying this as a Canaanite woman. And what she's asking by swearing an oath in the Lord's name is that the Lord would be the witness or the guarantor of this oath. And so that he now is the arbitrator. He is the one who gets to guarantee it, to bring up the consequences if this oath is broken. She is the one suggesting that God be this. And so she's inviting them into a covenant with her where God is at the middle of this covenant. And she says, because I have shown you allegiance, show allegiance to my family. Give me a solemn pledge that you will spare the lives of my father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all who belong to them, and rescue us from death. And the men said to her, if you die, we die too. By the way, that is the natural consequence of breaking an oath such as they're making. So they're giving like the second half. Yes, we are confirming that what we are stepping into is an oath that if we break it, we die. So if we die, may we die too. And if you do not report what we've been up to, then when the Lord hands the land over to us, we will show unswerving allegiance to you. Notice the tone they just used in that statement compared to what the 12 used 40 years ago. The 12, 40 years ago were like, yeah, we went in, it was great, but we can't do this. We have no confidence in God at all. And yet these two are saying, yes, when this happens, it's going to happen, when it happens, right? They're speaking with much more confidence in what God is up to. And so here they create this oath, this agreement together. Another thing that's interesting is this word allegiance. I don't know what your Bible has in that place, but it's the Hebrew word hesed, which is this loyal love, this loyal covenant relationship that we are going to be so fiercely loyal to each other that is how we love each other. In this hesed, loyal love. She understands that term. She understands that concept. And that's what she is inviting them into, the kind of relationship she is inviting them into. And so now starting in verse 15 through 24, we have sort of this clarification of the covenant, a restatement of it so that everybody is clear. And then how they escape. Rahab let them down by a rope through the window because her house was built as part of the city walls. She lived in the wall. And she told them, head to the hill country. That's a different direction than she sent the soldiers. So the ones chasing you don't find you. Hide from them there for 3 days, long enough that those chasing you will return, that they'll stop looking. And then you can make your way back across. The men said to her, we are not bound by this oath you made us swear unless the following conditions are met. So now they're putting conditions on the oath. When we invade the land, tie this red rope in the window through which you let us down, and gather together in your house your father, mother, your brothers, and all who live in your father's house. Anyone who leaves your house will be responsible for his own death. We are innocent in that case, but if anyone with you is in the house is harmed, we will be responsible. If you should report what we've been up to, then we are not bound by this oath that you just made us swear. She said to them, I agree to these conditions. So she sent them on their way and then tied the red rope to the window. They went to the hill country, stayed there for 3 days, long enough that those chasing him returned. Their pursuers looked all along the way but did not find them. Then the 2 men returned, going back to the river and across the fords. And they came to Joshua, son of Nun, and reported to him all they had discovered. And they told Joshua, surely the Lord is handing over all this land to us. All who live in the land are cringing before us. That's a completely different report than before, isn't it? And so that's the end of this little scene. And now we skip ahead to chapter 6, but in between the two, we have some really noteworthy things that happen. They've come back, now they're gathering their stuff together to go to war. And just like before, we have echoes of the past again when they go to cross the Jordan River. In the same way that the Red Sea was parted, meaning still water was pushed aside, in this case, the Jordan River, which was flowing, was stopped, and they'd crossed on dry land. So you see similarity but slight difference, just like we're seeing all the way through this story. And so they cross the Jordan with the water being stopped, and when they get to the other side, they worship. They take rocks from in the Jordan, and they pile them up on the other side, and they make an altar, a place of worship, and they worship God there. And then they do something quite unusual, something no military advisor would ever advise, and that is they circumcise all the men right before battle. This seems like a mistake, doesn't it? You can laugh. It's okay. It doesn't make sense. But here's what happened. Here's what it explains in chapter 5, is that for 40 years they had not circumcised men. Now remember, circumcision is the physical sign of the covenant that God had made with them, right? And for whatever reason, for 40 years, they hadn't been doing that. And so by actually doing this, it was a sign of their commitment and their faithfulness to God. It was them renewing this covenant that they believed God was now very tangibly giving them by going into the promised land and taking the rest of this area, that they stopped, they worshiped, and they circumcised everybody. And so it was really a significant act of faith. And then God gives them his plans for conquering Jericho. And the plan is that you're going to march around the city for 6 days, one time each day for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, you're going to march around 7 times, and then they blow their horns and the walls are going to come down, and in they go, and the city will be yours. What an unusual plan. Right? I mean, God's like testing their faith. Again, like, are you sure you trust me? Because I have this really crazy idea for a battle plan. And they do it. They don't say, no, thank you, we'll do it our own way. Like we have our own plan. They say, okay, like God, this is unusual, but we'll do it. And so they do. And so we're going to jump into the story now in chapter 6, verse 15, and see how all this concludes. On the 7th day, they were up at the crack of dawn, and they marched around the city as before. Only this time, they marched around it 7 times. And the 7th time around, the priests blew the ram's horns, and Joshua told the army, give the battle cry, for the Lord is handing the city over to you. The city and all that is in it must be set apart for the Lord, except for Rahab the prostitute, and all who are in her house, because she hid the spies we sent. Now, these next 2 verses, pay attention. You're going to take these and stick them in your back pocket for 2 weeks from now, because you're going to need them in 2 weeks, okay? But be careful when you're setting apart the riches for the Lord. If you take any of it, you will make the Israelite camp subject to annihilation and cause a disaster. All the silver and gold, as well as bronze, iron items, must belong to the Lord. They must go into the Lord's treasury. The ram's horn sounded, and when the army heard the signal, they gave a loud battle cry. The wall collapsed, and the warriors charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. They annihilated with the sword everything that breathed in the city, including men and women, young and old, as well as cattle, sheep, and donkeys. When we read this on a page, it's fairly sterile, but I want you to picture that for a moment. This is significant. What God has called them to do is not pretty, but they've been obedient and done it. Joshua told the two men who had spied on the land, enter the prostitute's house and bring out the woman and all who belong to her, as promised. As a side note, I wonder how many people were in that house. I mean, really, like if you're her and you know what's happening, like you're finding like your second uncle's 15th cousin on their mother's side and like, come on in, right? I mean, I bet that place was packed. So the young spies went and brought out Rahab, her father, mother, brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her whole family and took them to a place outside the Israelite camp. So you notice what they did. They escort them out of the city to a place next to where the Israelites are camped. But they burned the city and all that was in it, except for the silver, gold, bronze, and iron items they put in the treasury of the Lord's house. Yet Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her father's family, and all belonged to her. She lives in Israel to this very day because she hid the messengers. Joshua sent a spy on Jericho, I turned the page and I messed myself. Because she hid the messengers, Joshua sent to spy on Jericho. At that time, Joshua made this solemn declaration: the man who attempts to rebuild the city of Jericho will stand condemned before the Lord. He will lose his firstborn on the day he lays its foundations, and his youngest when he erects its gates. The Lord was with Joshua, and he became famous throughout the land. By the way, that comes true. That happens. This is a lot, right? The hero of the story was not who we expected. But we see how the whole story plays out and how her little place in the story completely changed the whole story. There was two things that kept jumping out at me as I was reading through this and studying through this. The first is that Rahab is an unlikely hero, yet she is exactly who God uses. And according to many of us in our culture, God's only supposed to use the shiny people. The people whose lives are all together, you know those? The folks who have no problems, no issues. They have it all together. They've always got it together. They always will have it together. That's who God's supposed to use, because that's why we put on the masks, we gussy ourselves up, we shine ourselves up to come to church, and when people say, how's it going? We're like, great, all the time, it's awesome. Never a bad day. I never struggle with anything. Life's perfect. Because we've told ourselves God only uses the shiny people. But there's no getting around who Rahab was. Almost every time she's mentioned in Scripture, she is referred to as Rahab the harlot. We can't soften who she was. That's who she was. She was also a Canaanite. They were the enemies. God used a non-Jewish person to be the hero. And not just a non-Jew, but a Canaanite of all people. They're going to be antagonists of the Jews for centuries to come still. Yet God lets her be the hero? He lets a person be the hero who their most famous act of faithfulness is to lie. Think about that. Their most famous act was an act of sin. And that's the person God says is the hero of the story. It's not who we expect it to be. This is scandalous. If you're a Jewish person, just maybe like a few decades later, hearing the story of how all this happened, you're like, what? God used who? Of all the people, God used her? That's not who God should have used. Yet it is. And if we tell ourselves that God is only supposed to use the perfect people, we need to go back and reread our Bibles, because he's using the imperfect people all the way through the story. I want us to picture what this would look like in modern day. All right? We have a ministry here in town, and we're doing something, whatever it is, and then the person who really blesses the ministry and puts it over the top and just makes it super effective in our community is a prostitute. Are we going to be okay with that? Does that make us uncomfortable? It's hard, isn't it? Because it rubs up against our values. And so we have to think about who was Rahab. She was a woman still in process. A woman who, again, knew enough to place her faith in Yahweh. She knew enough to know what she believed, but obviously not enough to transform her life. She was still doing the same things she had been doing. And so she had her flaws. And when we see those who have their flaws, we tend to focus on the flaws, don't we? Instead of encouraging them, coming alongside and lifting one another up and blessing each other and saying, how can I help you? Especially those who maybe are very immature and they're trying to really grow in their faith and do things for God and be obedient. And we tend to be like, oh yeah, but that person, yada, yada, yada. Instead of how do we come and buttress up with them and help grow them in what it is they're up to? Often we focus on the shortcomings, not their faith. Clearly, her lifestyle doesn't align with God's principles. We don't excuse anything of what she was. But we also can't deny that God didn't use her in a significant way. So we must be careful how we see one another. She clearly had a lot of transformation ahead of her if she was going to grow in her faith. And as we get to the rest of the story, of her story, we're going to see that likely happened. God did continue to grow her and use her. The second thing I noticed is that when the stakes were the highest, she trusted God. She could have easily said no thank you. She could have easily taken the guys upstairs, hit them, gone back downstairs, and when the soldiers came, she could have gone, yeah, they're upstairs. But she didn't. She risked everything at that moment for what God was doing. Because of her faith caused her to trust him with everything she had. Now, what's interesting is if we flip back in our Bibles a ways, and you can follow me if you'd like to Hebrews 11, or you can read up here, or you can go look at it later. But Hebrews 11 is what we call the Hall of Faith. It's this chapter where it lists all these people who are known for their faith, and the author of Hebrews is listing person after person after person, and here's what this person did to be faithful, and this person to be faithful, and this person to be faithful, and this how this one showed their faith. And the author's creating what they calls a cloud of witnesses for us. This way of as you and I are seeking to be faithful, here is all these people and how they were faithful before you. And that should give us courage and help spur us along to be more and more faithful. And in the middle of that list, with all of these folks we would consider giants of the faith, in verse 31, by faith, Rahab the prostitute escaped the destruction of the disobedient because she welcomed the spies in peace. And then we flip over just a couple pages to James chapter 2. And we have this several paragraphs here in the middle of chapter 2 telling us what faith is. That faith isn't just this mental assent to where we say, yes, I believe that, but faith comes out in how we live, in our actions, and how we conduct ourselves, and the decisions we make. And the author, James, gives us two examples. One is Abraham, and the other in verse 25. He says, and similarly, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out the other way? The military, the soldiers out the other way. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. Here she is. Her faithfulness, her trust of God is placed with all of the giants of the faith. All the people that we're not going to talk about in this series because they always get talked about. And here she is, obscure Rahab, placed in the same list with all of them. She gets the same honor in Jewish history as many of the giants of the faith, right there with Abraham and Moses and so many others, because she was faithful. The actions she took were out of trusting God, and she did not let fear stand in her way. Even though so much was at risk, she did not let fear win, and she was willing to risk her life to be faithful to God. This leads me to ask a couple questions of us. I want you to answer this for yourself. I did for myself, keep wrestling with it as I studied through this. Here's the first question. When was the last time your faith made you uncomfortable? Meaning that you felt God was asking you to do something that you're like, God, not real excited about that one, God. I'm uncomfortable that you're asking me to do this, and I know if I do this, it's going to... When was the last time that happened? When was the last time God was leading you, calling you to do something that scared you? That it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was to the next step of scary. God, you know what you're asking me to do, right? That's just not uncomfortable. That's scary. That induces fear and anxiety into my life. But I know you're asking me to do this, but when was the last time God led you to risk something for Him? To risk, that there was something meaningful to you, that if you were obedient, you know that this or these things were at risk if you did that. And you had to debate between that route or this route over here where you could be disobedient and retain all these things that are at risk over here. When was the last time your faith caused you to risk something? And similarly, when was the last time you felt called to do something that you knew, if God isn't in this with me, it will fail? Like I just know it, because what God is asking me to do is so big that if He isn't in this, it's going to fail. When was the last time? These questions are challenging for me. I mean, I know it, but even us pastor folks have these kind of struggles where I ask myself these questions and I'm like, oh, that's really uncomfortable, God. That's really convicting. I'm not sure I like the answers to those questions. Because see, I pray that our faith is not a timid faith. It's not a scared faith. It's not a figurative faith where we say, oh yeah, I believe, but I don't actually do anything that causes me to have to need it. Causes me to have any sort of discomfort or risk that I would actually have to need faith in that moment. I hope we aren't people that define our faith by comfort or ease or shiny, but by people who are moving, who are being obedient, even in situations where it is uncomfortable or risky or scary. That our fear doesn't win by helping us bail out and chicken out on what God has called us to do. That when he said, hey, I want you to do this, and we're like, we don't bail out. We say, okay, this is where we are faithful in this moment, in this time. I think there's an interesting principle at play here that's kind of uncomfortable for us. Rahab was a woman who had small amounts of information about God and what it meant to be faithful. She had relatively small amounts of transformation in her life at that moment. Yet she had huge amounts of faith. Many of us, we can be described as having tons of information about our faith in God. Many of us have experienced significant transformation in our lives. Yet if we're honest, when those moments occur that we're asked to be uncomfortable or take a risk, we have very little faith. Rahab's faith led her to not just play a significant role in this part of the story of Jericho and the Hebrew people, but also in leading us to Jesus. Because if you go to chapter 1 of the book of Matthew, we're given a genealogy of Jesus from him back to Abraham, linking him directly to Abraham, so important in the Jewish history. And if you read that genealogy, which many of us don't because they're boring, right? But in verse 5, you'll find this statement. Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Jesus came through Rahab's line. She was a great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus. Remember how they were taken out and kept safe beside the Israelite people? Well, at some point in time, my guess is because of her faith, because of her and probably her family to embracing the faith in Yahweh, they were welcomed in. And she met a man, and they got married, and they had kids. And we have Jesus. She played a huge role in getting to where we are because she trusted God. With what little she had of her faith and of her maturity, she trusted God. And so my prayer for us is that we are people of trust. That when things get tough, when the risks get high, when the discomfort gets high, that we would trust, just as Rahab did. Would you pray with me, please? Father, I love when you have an unexpected hero. Because, Father, it gives me hope that me, an average dude, us, average folk, that we can be used by you too. That simply by us being obedient, us being faithful, you will use us. That is your plan, after all. And no matter what our place may be, when we trust you, you honor us. So, Father, I don't know where we're all at right now. There's some here, I'm sure, who probably haven't trusted you at all, who are here and say, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in Jesus. I don't trust them. Father, please till their hearts, bring them to you, draw them. If that's you today, I would encourage you to consider your faith in God, that he is trustworthy in every way possible, to see his great plan and to consider if you could believe in him. Father, I'm sure there's some of us here today as well that have made statements of faith, but if we're honest, our lives haven't been transformed. And we maybe identify with Rahab, where we've We've acknowledged you, but our lives are far from what they should be. Father, give us that conviction. Not in guilt, but in grace. Father, give us folks that could walk alongside them, that could encourage them, could lift them up, that together we could be on this journey of maturing in you and understanding who you are in our faith and what that looks like, what you've called us to. And Father, I pray for all of us that each of us would ask ourselves these questions about our comforts and our risks and our fears. Father, you've made it clear that following you will cost us. We shouldn't expect to come follow you and have it cost us nothing. And so, Father, what is it you're calling us to, large or small, that just by faith we can step into, and you will use us in mighty ways? Thank you for your faithfulness, Father. Your work is amazing, and I pray that we are bold people for you in our community. So, Father, I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.